pandemic has impacted so many. So we are going to examine its effect on the real estate industry and what that means for you. We have Hartz Group executive Larry Garb with us today to discuss all the ins and outs of the real estate market. Today on the BizPo Show. Welcome to another week of the BizPo Show. I'm Dan Geltrude from New York City, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host from Dallas, Texas, Seth Denson. Seth, how are things in Texas?
Hey, buddy. Listen, another week. No more snow, no more cold. It's beautiful Texas. What can I say? Look, what can I say?
That's awesome. And I just want to say this to everybody in the audience. Last week, Seth and I had very similar ties. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I got a little loud this week. And as you could see, Seth is not that type of guy. So
hey, listen,
I feel very unique.
It's springtime in Texas, so I'm just bringing a little gray, not as a downer, but just because it's springtime and the colors are abloom. So.
Well, there you go. All right, so now you can tell us apart a little bit. So anyway, Seth, let's talk about the real estate industry.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to give you some insight as to what's going on in the New York metropolitan area. So what we're seeing here from my standpoint of housing market, price of houses, single family houses, absolutely taking off. On the other side of this, if you look at like New York City, office space, commercial space, not doing so well. And I'm curious as to whether that's similar as far as your part of the country there in Dallas.
It is and it's not. I mean, and I'll draw that correlation. Certainly we'll call it the surrounding suburban areas are doing quite well, but so is the metropolitan areas here. We don't have the metro challenges perhaps that you guys do up there, specifically in the Big Apple. In large part because we're Texas and the rules and regulations are different, but the real estate market's different, right? Cost of living is lower, there's no state income tax, and quite frankly, there's a lot of people flooding to get here, and they're flooding from states where they're used to paying more than they would pay here in Texas. So coming here and even living in higher cost neighborhoods is still a lower dollar average than maybe a middle class neighborhood in, let's say, Los Angeles or even New York City. So I think there are certain hot markets throughout the country, markets like Texas, markets like Arizona, Florida, those things. From a real estate perspective on the residential side. Commercial side, a whole different story, although I still don't think we're nearly as impacted negatively here as you guys are up there.
You know, it's interesting, Seth, because I think the real estate market is really highlighting what's happening as far as the migration of people and what's driving that. And we've talked about it before. It really comes down to cost of living and taxes. And things are just too expensive in certain parts of the country. And of course, that spills out into the real estate market. So I think over time, places, like New York metropolitan area are really going to feel the impact from a real estate standpoint as people just get fed up with the high taxes, because the markets you're talking about, Texas and Florida and Arizona, well, you know what? Big difference between what goes on down there from a tax perspective and what happens here in the Northeast.
Yeah, Dan, I'm going to add one more thing to that, and that's schools. These states are largely states that opened up their schools as well. I mean, in general, most of the year. And I think for a lot of parents who are thinking about their children's livelihood, and yes, we're balancing the safety and security and the pandemic and all of that, but they're looking at areas and saying, is my kid going to get to have the same experience? And in states like Texas and some of these others that went ahead and opened their schools, they certainly are. So I think that's playing into it. It's also playing into the fact that, I think a lot of people realize that they can work more remotely. They don't have to be in a metropolitan area. I think businesses are probably allowing their people to be a bit more remote. And I've even talked to people from up in your neck of the woods, Dan, who have said, there was no reason to continue to pay the high cost of living because my employer's allowing me to work remotely. So I didn't renew my lease on my apartment in Manhattan, or I decided, hey, it might be better quality of life. This was a time to move my children to a different state. And so, if we look, and I know that we'll get into this in a moment with our guest, but, I think there's two sides you got to look at this. The commercial real estate side, that, interestingly enough, I wonder if it will come back at the level it is. I mean, August numbers of last year had the global commercial real estate market down 29%. But specifically to New York residential, the prices in New York City had dropped by 30%, but closings were down up to 40%. And again, I think that's a combination of people saying, I don't have to be in the city, I don't have to pay these prices. But here's one other thing that we haven't talked about. The pandemic and the impact of it was greater in more metro areas. And I think people looked at the idea of, if I'm living in a little bit more of American suburbia, the odds of me contracting COVID might be lower.
I think what's happened as you bring up the pandemic, Seth, and it's really spot on. I think what's happened is the pandemic has accelerated the use of technology across the board. And that certainly has an impact on many industries beyond real estate. But today we're focused in on real estate. So it's exactly to the point of, when people are looking where they're going to live, it used to be, where am I going to work? And that dictates where I'm going to live. That's changed now, and you can really look at it and say, well, where do I want to live? And my job comes with me. So the world has changed, and I think that change is going to be pretty permanent. So as we see the cycles of real estate, like everything else, go up and down, I think there's also going to be a shift in those cycles depending on geographically where you're located in the country. So when we come back, we will have Larry Garb from the Hartz Group to talk to us about all things real estate. Welcome back to the BizPo Show. Today's guest is Executive Vice President and Managing Director of the Hartz Group, Larry Garb. So let me just provide some background related to the company that Larry works with, the Hartz Group. The Hartz Group is the largest owner of commercial real estate in the state of New Jersey, and it was founded in 1926 by Max Stern, and he started this whole empire by selling canaries that he imported from Germany, built up a large pet product company, and then transitioned it into real estate. So over the years, Hartz has evolved into a diversified real estate company, and they have more than 44 million square feet of industrial, hotel, office, multifamily, and retail properties. So Larry, welcome to the BizPo Show.
Thank you, Dan.
So listen, let's get right into it. So the pandemic has impacted so many industries across the economic spectrum. So overall, how has COVID changed the real estate industry, and what changes do you think are going to be permanent?
Well, Dan, I think it's very asset class dependent. It's hard to generalize the real estate industry because you have asset classes ranging from hotels that we're involved in all the way to warehouse distribution, which we are also heavily involved in. And those markets are 180 degrees from each other. Hotels are suffering the worst of any asset class. The hospitality sector continues to suffer. Tourism is non-existent. Business travel is non-existent. So the hotel sector will suffer, and we think it's going to take years for it to really recover, until tourism comes back, until business travel recovers. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you have warehouse distribution business, which we couldn't be happier to be in. It's booming, high rent growth, very low vacancy numbers. Any space that becomes available is being eaten up as quicker than we can get a lease out the door. So it really is a function of asset class. That said, I think a lot of things we've seen are acceleration of trends, right? Brick and mortar retail, we were hearing pre-pandemic was going away. E-commerce was growing. And I think what we've done is accelerated a lot of trends that may have existed pre-pandemic. I think By 5 years, you read people say even more than that, but I think by 5 years we've accelerated the brick and mortar to e-commerce trends that we were seeing pre-pandemic. And to a lesser extent, we were seeing a lot more remote working from home, people flex hours, flex schedules, hoteling in offices, and that existed pre-pandemic, but I think that is here to stay, and that clearly has accelerated as virtually most offices, most corporate offices remain empty today.
Larry, you touched on e-commerce and the trend that it was expanding in pre-pandemic, and as you mentioned, right? I mean, we just fast forwarded that, to your point, 5 years. Obviously, that's having a tremendous impact, I got to think, on commercial real estate. Do you think post-pandemic it will regress at all, or is that just kind of here to stay, and that's the way it's going to be going forward?
I think that's here to stay. And one of the other factors, again, an acceleration of a trend. What trend did we see? When e-commerce started, we were all happy with 3, 4, 5-day delivery of our goods that we ordered online. Then it went to Amazon 2-day, and then it went to next day, and now it's same day, and now it's next hour. So what does that mean? You need warehouses not in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, serving New York City, or Southern New Jersey serving New York City. You need to be in New York City or right on top of New York City to serve those clients. So what we're seeing is a growth of warehouse space being taken up close inner city. To give you an example, Amazon now has 12 warehouses in the 5 boroughs of New York City. You would have never thought that was the case years ago. They have 20, I think they've leased 24 warehouses just outside of New York City in the past year, including New Jersey, Long Island, Westchester. You need to be able to deliver that space, deliver those goods same day within an hour. And I think there's going to be an insatiable appetite for well-located, well-suited industrial properties. And when I say well-suited, the other phenomena is parking, right? We all see these Sprinter vans, these minivans running around our neighborhoods delivering goods. They need a place to park. So a warehouse that doesn't have parking for those vans has become much less an asset that an Amazon or one of the big delivery companies are willing to lease.
You mentioned warehouse space specifically, but with so many people now working remotely, I got to think that commercial real estate, well, I know commercial real estate's been negatively impacted, specifically in areas like New York City. Is there a path to recovery there, or is this also the new norm where people will be working from home and maybe commercial real estate from that perspective, maybe Class A space doesn't come back?
I've had a lot of discussions with people in different industries, companies, about what their plans are for office space. And I think this is that we have a permanent trend here. I think there's going to be a permanent impairment of commercial office space, especially in inner cities, for at least the next decade. One of the things that people are doing, I've had a conversation with a major financial institution that said they expect their office footprint to be 25% less post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. And when you think a major financial institution reducing their square footage, they probably have millions of square feet across the country by 25%, and then extrapolate that across the rest of corporate America, that's a lot of office space. We've been talking to many tech companies where they're going to just maintain their corporate headquarters, and branch offices are going away. They can work fine with Zoom and handle calls and technical assistance and help desk type support functions remotely. So, I do think that this is, at least for the foreseeable future, a permanent change. And I think the office space will struggle. Now, one of the other things is that there's been a little bit of a flight back to the suburbs. The suburban office market, especially where we are in New Jersey, was weakening for years and years and years. And we had ourselves started to get out of that asset class, but we are actually seeing a little bit of tick up in the suburban office because people don't want to ride elevators up 50 floors with 15 other people. They don't want to have to take mass transit to work. So if you can offer them a place they can drive to, not have to get on mass transit, and maybe only go up an elevator 3 floors with 2 other people, it's a lot more palatable to the workforce right now.
Larry, there's been an explosion in the demand for residential real estate. Now, do you think that is all because of the pandemic or perhaps low interest rates? What do you think are the driving forces behind that?
I think as much as you hear it's pandemic related, I really think it's more a function of interest rates right now, that people are taking advantage of the super low rates and the fear that they're hearing rates are going to be going up, and let's jump on it right now while rates are low. I do think there is some level of pandemic related rationale for people buying homes. One of the things we see in our multifamily residential rental portfolio is that 2 and 3 bedroom apartments are now the hot unit type, not studios and ones anymore, because people need what? They need a home office space. Whether they're going to be home for 2 days or 3 days post-pandemic or 1 day, they don't want to be, we've all been on Zoom calls with people sitting on beds in their bedrooms. People want a home office. And I think space, people have gotten frustrated living in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment near the inner city and saying, hey, I'm only going back into the city 2 or 3 days a week, even when all this is over. Let me get in the house, let me build myself a home office, and I have that much more space. And I think also you have the not go, people are willing to commute, suffer the commute a little bit more if they know they're only going in 2 or 3 days a week as opposed to 5 days. Why do a lot of people live, in right outside of in major cities or right outside of major cities to reduce their commute time? And if you don't have the commute, there's no reason to be there.
Larry, in your opinion, what has been the biggest challenge faced by real estate owners during this pandemic?
In my world, it's collections, and collections, right? Because the hammer that we as landlords always had was the ability, we can evict somebody. You don't pay your rent, guess what? We're going to go to court and get you evicted. But what has happened? There's a moratorium on definitely on residential evictions, and it happened to be in New Jersey where we have most of our assets on commercial evictions as well. So we can't get into landlord-tenant court to kick out a commercial tenant. So clearly there's a policy perspective that you don't want to kick a residential tenant out of their home and make them homeless if they can't afford it, and we clearly understand that and appreciate that. But we can't kick a commercial tenant. We could have a commercial tenant that occupies 300,000 square feet, fully operating, maybe in an e-commerce business and thriving, and they don't have to pay their rent right now because that same 300,000 square foot tenant's in the same box as somebody who lives in a studio apartment building. So that's been our biggest challenge of having to deal with, and luckily our collections are well into the 90s, and a lot of people that I've talked to in the industry are experiencing the same thing, that collections aren't as bad as everybody originally anticipated at the start of the pandemic. But, if somebody wants to play games with you and not pay their rent and really doesn't care about their credit that much, maybe has a shell company on their lease, it's difficult to deal with them right now because the hammer that you used to have to be able to evict doesn't exist right now.
So, Larry, there's been a lot of talk about us going into an inflationary period. So, do you think that we're headed towards inflation? And if you think that we are, what kind of impact is that going to have on the real estate industry?
Short answer, yes. I mean, we've had, I think the last 10 years, we've averaged in this country 1.8% inflation, which is obviously exceptionally low. And I think given all the stimulus that's being pumped into the economy, I don't think there's any question we're going to end up in an inflationary period in the relatively near future. I'm not sure how high, but I think there's no question that we're in for more inflation than we've experienced in the last decade. As it relates to real estate, real estate inflation's kind of different. I mean, it can have positives and negatives. The positives of inflation on residential real estate, what happens? Just like the cost of your groceries and the cost of your gasoline and the cost of everything else you buy, what goes up? Your rent. So rent will increase typically during inflationary periods. So that's obviously a positive. The other positive is for people that own residential rental real estate is what goes up. Interest rates go up. So that means the cost of a mortgage goes up, makes houses less affordable, and more people have to rent. So those are some of the positives that happen to real estate in an inflationary period. The downside is, well, as an owner of real estate, your mortgage costs are going to go up. When you go to refinance your mortgage, you're going to be paying higher interest rates. And that most of the time translates to higher cap rates. And cap rates are what drives how you determine value of a property. So a higher cap rate means something that you bought at a 5% cap rate last year now is at a 6% cap rate is going to be % less than it was last year. Now, maybe increasing rents will help offset that, but the two don't always correlate with each other.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for all that information. I don't know if anybody could have really given us more insight as to what's happening in the real estate industry. So I want to thank you for Seth and I hope you'll come back real soon.
Thank
We'll be
you.
right back. Welcome back to the BizPo Show. If you're a regular viewer, you know that Seth and I like to leave you with our final thoughts each week. So here's mine. You know, I am the son of an immigrant, and when I think about that whole process of the American dream, it's really something special. And if you look at what I had to say in introducing Larry Garb and specifically the company he works for, the Hartz Group, we talked about that is a success story related to immigration. And I think when we look at what's going on in our country right now, we have to look at going back perhaps a few generations and see what was motivating our ancestors to come over here for a better way of life. And in spite of the challenges that we face, political, social, and otherwise, I have to say, I believe that the American dream is still alive. People are still trying to come to this country every single day for a better way of life. So I would just say, perhaps every once in a while, let's just sit back and think about what it took for us, all of us, to be in this very special place, this melting pot called the United States of America. And that's my final thought.
Well, Dan, you know, for my final thought this week, somewhat along the same lines, but maybe a little bit different, but that sit back part. You know, it's springtime, especially here in Texas, as I mentioned at the top of the show. And kids all around, my kids, taking spring breaks. Springtime is always a good time, at least it has been. But 1 year ago, springtime brought on something new, brought on a change to the way our world worked. And instead of a relaxing time and a time for new rebirth and life and opportunity, it brought on a lot of hardship and it brought on a lot of fear. And we're now 1 year into that springtime that didn't change. So my final thought this week is kind of a thought of hope and a thought of promise for the new springtime. That maybe this springtime will bring what past springtimes have, but maybe not what 2020s did. And my encouragement is for everyone to take that sit back and look at life a bit differently. It seems like over this past year, things move slow, but really, really fast. What I mean by that is we seem to escalate very quickly. We can look back at the way the markets reacted to things like GameStop, the way that we react politically to things, the way that scandals come and go. And we seem to want to move really, really fast. And sometimes maybe that's just not the right way. Growing up, I remember a commercial that said, "The best things come to those who wait." And maybe it's time for us to just sit back and wait, to think about life just a bit differently, to slow down and enjoy life a bit more, and to recognize that if we don't think long-term likely won't think about us. Life is a game of chess, not checkers. Let's start thinking 5 moves ahead and enjoy our lives around us, but think long-term. And that's my final thought.
Amen, brother. That's a great thought. Well, that does it for this week's show. We hope you'll tell your friends about us and continue to tune in each week. From New York City, I'm Dan Geltrude.
And from Dallas, Texas, I'm Seth Denson. Good night.